Billionaire was furious his ex wouldn't sign divorce, until he saw her post a photo with a newborn. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Lachlan Vance's penthouse office, 40 stories above Silicon Valley. At 39, he commanded an empire worth $12 billion, his sharp jawline and steel-gray eyes as legendary in boardrooms as his ruthless precision. His dark hair, always perfectly styled, caught the glow of multiple monitors displaying real-time market data from around the world. Lachlan adjusted his Italian silk tie and glanced at his Patek Philippe watch. 11:47 p.m. Another 18-hour day dissolving into the next. This was his life now. Numbers, algorithms, and the cold satisfaction of building something that would outlast him. His assistant had left hours ago, but his lawyer's message still blinked urgently on his phone. "We need to discuss the Marin situation. She's still refusing to sign." Hollis Marin. Even her name sent an unwelcome jolt through his chest, like touching a live wire he thought he'd learned to avoid. 8 months since he'd walked out of their Palo Alto home. 8 months since he'd made the most logical decision of his life, and she still wouldn't let it go. Lachlan pulled up his contacts and scrolled to her name. Blocked. Their shared email account. Deactivated. Even their mutual friends had gone silent, choosing sides in a war he never intended to fight. Stubborn as always, he muttered, though something deeper than frustration gnawed at him. He'd met Hollis 4 years ago at a tech conference in Austin. She wasn't supposed to be there. She worked in sustainable urban planning, had gotten a last-minute invite from a friend. While other women at these events positioned themselves strategically around wealthy men, Hollis had been arguing passionately with a panel speaker about corporate responsibility in developing communities. Her auburn hair had caught the stage lights as she gestured, and when she'd turned toward the audience, Lachlan had seen her fully for the first time. Heart-shaped face, expressive hazel eyes that seemed to change color with her emotions, and skin that held the faintest constellation of freckles across her nose. She'd worn a simple blue dress that day, nothing designer, but she'd commanded the room with pure authenticity. Lachlan had approached her afterward, expecting the usual dance of impressed small talk. Instead, Hollis had looked him directly in the eye and said, "You're Lachlan Vance. Your company just bought out 3 sustainable housing projects to build luxury condos. I'm curious, how do you sleep at night?" No one had challenged him like that in years. Most people wanted something from him. Hollis had wanted answers. Their first date lasted 14 hours. Coffee became lunch, became a walk through the city, became dinner, became sitting on her apartment steps until sunrise, talking about everything from childhood dreams to the responsibility that came with power. She'd grown up in Portland, the daughter of a librarian and a social worker who'd taught her that wealth meant nothing without purpose. "Money is just a tool," she'd said that night, her voice soft in the pre-dawn quiet. "The question is what you build with it." Lachlan had fallen completely, helplessly in love. For 3.5 years, Hollis had been his anchor to something real. She'd challenged his assumptions, softened his edges, made him laugh at ridiculous movies and question whether acquiring another company was really what would make him happy. Their Palo Alto home had been filled with her plants, her books, her terrible attempts at cooking elaborate meals that always ended with them ordering takeout and laughing on the kitchen floor. But as Vance Tech grew exponentially, so did the pressure. 18-hour days became 20-hour days. Business trips stretched longer. Board meetings multiplied. Lachlan found himself resenting anything that pulled his focus from the empire he was building. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built Vance Tech to create the life he wanted, but somewhere along the way, Vance Tech had become the life that consumed everything else. The final argument had been vicious and swift. Hollis had planned a weekend getaway for their 4th anniversary. Lachlan had canceled last minute for an emergency acquisition meeting. "When did I become an interruption in your life?" she'd asked, standing in their bedroom doorway in the dress she'd bought for their anniversary dinner. "This deal could change everything," he'd replied, not even looking up from his laptop. "It already has." The silence that followed had been deafening. When he'd finally looked up, tears were streaming down her face. "I love you, Lachlan, but I can't compete with a company that will never love you back." That night, lying beside her as she pretended to sleep, Lachlan had made his decision. Clean break. It was better for both of them. She deserved someone who could prioritize her. He needed to focus on what he'd built. The next morning, he'd told her he wanted a divorce. Now, 8 months later, as rain continued its relentless assault on his office windows, Lachlan realized he'd been lying to himself about how clean the break had been. He opened his laptop and, for the first time in months, searched for Hollis on social media. Her accounts had been private when they were together. She'd valued her privacy. But maybe now, her Instagram appeared, public now. The profile picture showed her laughing, hair slightly windblown, more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. His chest tightened. Lachlan scrolled through recent posts. Photos of Portland. She'd moved back home. Images of coffee shops, parks, books, normal life, life without him. Then he stopped breathing. The most recent post, uploaded just hours ago, showed Hollis in what looked like a hospital room, her hair pulled back in a soft ponytail, wearing a simple blue hospital gown. But it wasn't Hollis that made his world tilt off its axis. It was the tiny baby cradled against her chest. The infant couldn't be more than days old, skin still red and wrinkled, eyes closed in perfect peace. Hollis's face radiated a joy Lachlan had never seen before, pure and transformative. The caption read, "Everything I never knew I needed. Welcome to the world, little one. 15 days old today. 15 days. Lachlan's hands shook as he counted backward. The timeline crashed over him like ice water. The baby's delicate features, the shape of the nose, even the way one tiny hand was curled into a fist, exactly like Lachlan did when he slept. This was his child, his son. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering to the marble floor of his office. For the first time in 8 months, Lachlan Vance, the man who'd built an empire through cold logic and calculated risk, felt completely, utterly lost. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away a world that had just changed forever. What would you do if you discovered you had a child you never knew existed? Would you fight for a second chance or accept that some choices can't be undone? Lachlan hadn't slept. For 36 hours, he'd paced the marble floors of his penthouse. The Instagram photo burned into his retinas like a scar. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Hollis's radiant smile and the perfect curve of his son's tiny fingers. His son. The words felt foreign on his tongue, like speaking a language he'd never learned but somehow understood in his bones. At 6 a.m., Lachlan stood before his bathroom mirror, noting the dark circles under his steel-gray eyes and the stubble that made him look more human than he'd appeared in months. His usual armor, the perfectly pressed suits, the commanding presence, felt inadequate now. How do you dress to meet a child who doesn't know you exist? He'd tried everything to reach Hollis. Her old number went straight to a generic voicemail. Their shared email bounced back. Even her LinkedIn profile had vanished, as if she'd systematically erased every digital footprint that could lead him to her. But Lachlan hadn't built a $12 billion empire by accepting defeat. He called Marcus Chen, his head of security, a former FBI agent who'd helped him navigate corporate espionage and hostile takeovers. If anyone could find Hollis, it was Marcus. "I need you to locate someone," Lachlan said without preamble when Marcus answered. Business or personal? The question hung in the air. Everything in Lachlan's world had been business for so long that the distinction felt almost meaningless. But this was the most personal thing he'd ever done. Personal. "Hollis Marin, she's in Portland. Your ex-wife. I thought the divorce was—" "It's complicated." Lachlan's voice cracked slightly. "I need her address, Marcus, and I need it today." There was a pause. Marcus had worked for Lachlan for 3 years, had seen him negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking. He'd never heard his boss sound vulnerable. "I'll have something within 6 hours." Lachlan hung up and walked to his home office, where the walls were lined with awards, magazine covers featuring his face, and framed photos of Vance Tech's greatest achievements. But now these symbols of his success felt hollow, like monuments to a life he'd chosen over everything that mattered. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, the only drawer he kept locked. Inside, beneath important documents and backup hard drives, lay a small velvet box he hadn't opened in 8 months. Hollis's engagement ring. She'd thrown it at him the morning he'd asked for the divorce, the platinum band skittering across their marble kitchen floor like a wounded bird. She'd been wearing her favorite yellow sundress, the one that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, and her hair had caught the morning light streaming through their bay windows. "Keep it," she'd said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Sell it. Add it to your portfolio. Turn it into another number on your balance sheet. But Lachlan had picked up the ring, a 3-carat solitaire he'd chosen because it was classic and elegant like her, and locked it away. He'd told himself it was just expensive jewelry, but deep down, he'd known the truth. It was hope. Hope that someday, somehow, he'd be worthy of putting it back on her finger. Now, staring at the ring, he wondered if that day would ever come. His phone buzzed. Marcus. Earlier than promised. I found her. 2847 Burnside Street, apartment 3B. It's a small complex in southeast Portland. Lachlan. Marcus paused. There's something else. What? Hospital records show she gave birth 15 days ago. St. Mary's Medical Center. The father's name on the birth certificate is listed as unknown. The words hit Lachlan like a physical blow. Unknown. She'd erased him so completely that their son would grow up believing he had no father at all. There's more, Marcus continued. She's working as a project coordinator for Portland Community Housing Initiative. It's a nonprofit focused on affordable housing development. The pay is, he paused diplomatically, modest. Lachlan closed his eyes. Hollis had given up everything. Their shared life, their comfortable home, their financial security, to start over. And she'd done it while carrying his child alone. Send me the address, Lachlan said. And Marcus, this stays between us. Understood. Within an hour, Lachlan was on his private jet to Portland, staring out at clouds that seemed to mirror the storm in his chest. He'd made this flight dozens of times for business, but never had the journey felt so consequential. As the plane descended through the Pacific Northwest's perpetual mist, Lachlan tried to imagine what he'd say. How do you apologize for missing the birth of your child? How do you explain that you'd spent 8 months believing logic was more important than love? The Portland skyline came into view, smaller than San Francisco, greener, more human in scale. This was where Hollis had grown up, where she'd learned to value community over conquest. No wonder she'd returned here to heal. Lachlan's driver met him at the airport, but instead of heading to a downtown hotel, they drove through residential neighborhoods filled with modest homes, tree-lined streets, and the kind of life Lachlan had forgotten existed. People walked dogs, children played in front yards, neighbors talked over fences. It was a world away from the competitive isolation of Silicon Valley. 47. Burnside Street was a 3-story brick building, probably built in the 1940s, with flower boxes on the fire escapes and a small community garden in the front yard. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors' names and borrowed cups of sugar. Lachlan sat in the car for 20 minutes watching the building's windows, trying to guess which one was hers. Did she still read before bed? Did she still hum while she cooked? Did she ever think about him? A woman emerged from the building's front door, pushing a stroller. Lachlan's heart stopped. It was Hollis, but different. Her auburn hair was longer now, pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a soft green sweater that made her eyes look like sea glass. There was something new in her posture, a confidence he'd never seen before, as if she'd found a strength she didn't know she possessed. And in the stroller, bundled in a blue blanket, was the baby from the photo, his son. Lachlan watched as Hollis walked down the sidewalk, stopping to chat with an elderly neighbor who cooed over the baby. Her smile was radiant, unguarded in a way it had never been during their marriage. She looked free. The realization hit him like a tsunami. Hollis was happy, not just content, not just surviving, but genuinely, deeply happy, without him. For the first time since seeing that Instagram photo, Lachlan wondered if finding her was the right thing to do. What if his presence would only destroy the peace she'd built? What if she was better off without him? But then the baby stirred in the stroller, and even from across the street, Lachlan could see the tiny face that was unmistakably his own. This wasn't just about Hollis anymore. This was about a child who deserved to know his father, even if that father had taken far too long to find his way home. Lachlan stepped out of the car and began walking toward the woman who'd once been his whole world, and the son who didn't yet know his name. Hollis Marin had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense when she was being watched. Growing up with an anxiety disorder had sharpened her intuition to a razor's edge, and right now, every instinct screamed that someone's eyes were tracking her movement down Burnside Street. She glanced over her shoulder casually, adjusting baby Oliver's blanket as she did. Her heart nearly stopped. Lachlan Vance stood 50 feet away, hands buried deep in the pockets of his charcoal wool coat, looking like a statue carved from granite and regret. Even at this distance, she could see the exhaustion etched into his angular features, the way his normally perfect hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his fingers through it for hours. For a moment, time suspended itself. 8 months collapsed into nothing, and she was back in their kitchen, watching him choose his empire over their marriage, choosing logic over love, choosing everything except her. Oliver stirred in his stroller, making the soft mewing sounds that meant he'd be hungry soon. The sound snapped Hollis back to reality, this reality, where she was a single mother who'd spent 9 months preparing for a life that didn't include the man now walking toward her with measured, deliberate steps. She could run, turn the stroller around, duck into Mrs. Patterson's flower shop, disappear into the maze of Portland's side streets. But Oliver deserved better than a mother who ran from hard conversations, and despite everything, Lachlan deserved to know he had a son. So she waited. As he approached, Hollis noticed the subtle changes 8 months had carved into him. His face was leaner, sharper, as if stress had refined him down to his essential elements. His steel-gray eyes, once cold and calculating, now held something she'd rarely seen there: uncertainty. "Hello, Hollis." His voice was rougher than she remembered, like sandpaper over silk. He stopped 6 feet away, close enough to see Oliver's sleeping face but far enough to respect the invisible barrier she'd erected around herself. "Hello, Lachlan." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I wondered when you'd find me. You knew I'd see the photo." It wasn't a question. Hollis had made her Instagram public 3 weeks ago, after Oliver's birth, knowing that eventually Lachlan would search for her. She'd wanted him to find out this way, through a moment of joy rather than a legal document or a confrontational phone call. "I did." She looked down at Oliver, whose dark hair caught the afternoon light exactly like his father's. "I thought you had the right to know." "The right to know?" Lachlan's carefully controlled facade cracked slightly. "Hollis, you put father unknown on his birth certificate. You disappeared completely. If I hadn't searched for you, you would have what? Rushed to Portland? Canceled board meetings to hold my hand during labor?" The words came out sharper than intended, but Hollis couldn't pull them back. "You made your choice 8 months ago. I respected it." Lachlan flinched as if she'd slapped him. "That's not— I never wanted this. I never wanted to miss." He gestured helplessly toward the stroller. "Then you shouldn't have left." The simplicity of her statement hung between them like a blade. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her flower shop, noticed the tension, and quickly retreated. A jogger altered his path to give them space. Even strangers could feel the weight of this conversation. Oliver chose that moment to wake up, his tiny fists emerging from the blanket as he made soft, demanding sounds. Hollis immediately shifted into mother mode, lifting him from the stroller with practiced ease, settling him against her shoulder with the kind of natural grace that comes from 3 weeks of round-the-clock bonding. Lachlan's sharp intake of breath was audible. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. Oliver had Lachlan's strong jawline in miniature, the same dark hair that would probably curl when it grew longer, and eyes that were already showing hints of gray. "What's his name?" Lachlan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Oliver James Marin." She'd chosen James for her father, who'd died when she was 16 and never got to meet his grandson. The name felt solid, grounding, nothing like the sharp efficiency of Lachlan's world. "Oliver," Lachlan repeated, as if testing how the syllables fit in his mouth. Can I hold him?" The request caught Hollis off guard. During their marriage, Lachlan had been awkward around children, always deferring to her when friends brought their kids around. He'd claimed he didn't have the instinct for it, that his hands were better suited for keyboards than babies. "He just woke up," she said carefully. "He might cry with a stranger." The word stranger hit its target. Lachlan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. Oliver's birth announcement screenshot, which he'd apparently saved. "I've been staring at this photo for 36 hours, he said. "I haven't slept. I haven't eaten. I flew here the moment I found your address because the thought of my son not knowing I exist is killing me." "Your son?" Hollis shifted Oliver to her other arm, a protective gesture that wasn't lost on Lachlan. "Biology doesn't make you a father, Lachlan. Being there does. Showing up does. Choosing your family over everything else does. You're right." The admission seemed to surprise them both. "You're absolutely right. I wasn't a good husband. I wasn't there when it mattered. But Hollis, I'm here now. For how long? Until Vance Tech has its next crisis? Until some merger requires your undivided attention?" Until you remember that your real life is in Silicon Valley and we're just a complication in Portland? Each question was an arrow finding its mark, and Hollis could see Lachlan struggling to formulate an answer that wouldn't sound like another empty promise. Oliver began to fuss, his tiny face scrunching with pre-cry concentration. Hollis automatically started the gentle bouncing motion that usually calmed him, but he was building toward one of his impressive wails. "He's hungry," she explained, reaching for the diaper bag hanging on the stroller. "I need to feed him." "Here? There's a bench in the community garden." She nodded toward a small green space beside their building. "Unless you have somewhere else to be?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Lachlan could walk away now, retreat to whatever five-star hotel he'd booked, and they could handle this through lawyers and scheduled visitations. Or he could stay and witness the unglamorous reality of new parenthood, the feeding, the burping, the potential screaming. "I'll stay," he said quietly. They walked to the garden in silence, Oliver's cries growing more insistent. Hollis settled on a wooden bench beneath a maple tree that was just beginning to show autumn colors. She'd done this dozens of times over the past 3 weeks, but never with an audience, never with the man whose child she was feeding. "You might want to look away," she said, adjusting her sweater. But Lachlan didn't look away. He watched with an intensity that was almost scientific, as if trying to memorize every detail of this moment he'd missed 15 times already. The way Hollis's face softened when Oliver latched on, the immediate peace that settled over the baby, the profound intimacy of a mother nourishing her child. "He looks like you," Hollis said softly, breaking the silence. "He has your stubborn streak. 3 weeks old and already making demands." The smallest smile tugged at Hollis's lips, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd shown him. "You should see him at 3 a.m., very clear about his expectations. You're doing this alone? The night feedings, the diaper changes, everything. I chose this, Lachlan. When you walked away, I knew what I was accepting." She looked down at Oliver, whose eyes had drifted closed in contentment. "I'm not looking for rescue. I'm not looking for anything from you. What if I'm looking for something from you?" The question hung in the autumn air like a prayer. Hollis studied his face, searching for the man she'd once loved beneath the polished exterior of the billionaire who'd broken her heart. "What could you possibly want from me that you can't buy?" "Forgiveness," he said simply. "A chance to know my son. Maybe a chance to be the man I should have been 8 months ago." Oliver finished feeding and immediately spit up on Hollis's shoulder, a perfectly timed reminder that life with a baby was beautifully, chaotically unpredictable. She reached for a burp cloth, and without thinking, Lachlan handed her one from the diaper bag. The simple gesture stopped them both. His hand brushed hers as she took the cloth, and for a moment, they were just two people caring for their child. "I have conditions," Hollis said finally, patting Oliver's back with gentle rhythm. "Name them. No lawyers, no custody battles, no trying to control this situation like it's a business acquisition. If you want to be part of Oliver's life, you do it my way, on my terms, in my city." Lachlan nodded slowly. "And if I agree, then maybe we can figure out what co-parenting looks like between a billionaire and a nonprofit worker who happen to have the most beautiful baby in Portland." As if summoned by the compliment, Oliver let out a magnificent burp that echoed through the small garden. Despite everything, the hurt, the anger, the uncertainty, both parents laughed. It was the first moment of joy they'd shared in 8 months, and it belonged entirely to their son. 3 days later, Lachlan stood outside a modest coffee shop called Grounded in southeast Portland, holding 2 cups of what the barista had enthusiastically described as locally roasted, fair trade, single-origin Ethiopian. The coffee cost more than most people's lunch, but less than Lachlan typically spent on a single espresso in Silicon Valley. Everything in Portland operated on a different scale. He was 20 minutes early for his scheduled visit with Oliver. Hollis had agreed to 2-hour supervised meetings 3 times a week until they could establish trust. The terms felt like a custody arrangement designed for a recovering addict, but Lachlan had accepted without argument. He was the one who needed to prove himself worthy. Through the coffee shop's large windows, he could see Hollis settling into a corner booth, Oliver's car seat positioned where she could easily monitor him. She'd chosen a public place for their second meeting, somewhere with witnesses and escape routes. The message was clear. She still didn't trust him not to disappear again. Lachlan pushed through the door, grateful for the bell that announced his arrival, and gave Hollis a moment to prepare for his presence. She looked up from her laptop. Something sleek and functional, probably 5 years old. Nothing like the top-of-the-line machines his company produced each year. Ethiopian, he said, setting her coffee down with the reverence of someone presenting a peace offering. The barista promised it would change my life. Bold claim for a Tuesday morning. Hollis accepted the cup, but didn't drink immediately. Instead, she watched him settle across from her, noting how he'd traded his usual designer suits for dark jeans and a navy sweater that made his gray eyes look almost blue. You look different. I'm trying to blend in with the locals. He gestured around the coffee shop, where bearded men in flannel typed on vintage laptops and women with elaborate tattoos discussed urban farming. How am I doing? Like a billionaire pretending to be a hipster, Hollis said. But there was amusement in her voice. The Rolex kind of gives you away. Lachlan glanced down at his watch, a $50,000 piece that had been a gift to himself after his first billion. In this setting, it looked as subtle as a neon sign. I'll work on it, he said, then shifted his attention to the car seat. How's he sleeping? 4 hours at a stretch now. Sometimes 5 if I'm lucky. Hollis's face softened as she looked at their son. He's starting to focus on faces more. Yesterday he smiled, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't gas. Can I? Lachlan started to reach toward the car seat, then stopped himself. Is it okay if I take him out? He's awake, Hollis confirmed, though her body language remained tense as Lachlan carefully lifted Oliver from his seat. The baby was heavier than Lachlan had expected, more substantial somehow. At 3 weeks old, Oliver had already grown noticeably, his features becoming more defined. His dark hair showed hints of curl, and his eyes, definitely gray now, tracked Lachlan's face with startling intensity. Hello, Oliver, Lachlan said softly, adjusting his hold to better support the baby's head. I'm your father. I know that doesn't mean much to you yet, but I'm hoping we can work on that. Oliver stared at him solemnly, as if considering this information, then promptly spit up on Lachlan's expensive sweater. Welcome to parenthood, Hollis said, handing him a burp cloth. He's an equal opportunity spitter. Doesn't matter if you're wearing Target or Tom Ford. Lachlan cleaned himself off without complaint, more focused on the warm weight of his son in his arms than the cashmere that was probably ruined. Does he always study people like this? Like he's solving a puzzle? He gets that from you. That intense stare when you're processing information. Hollis sipped her coffee, watching Lachlan discover the particular challenge of holding a conversation while supporting a baby's wobbly head. Though hopefully he'll use his powers for good instead of hostile takeovers. Ouch. But Lachlan was smiling as he said it. I suppose I deserve that. You deserve a lot worse than gentle mockery over artisanal coffee. They fell into a rhythm over the next hour, Lachlan holding Oliver while Hollis answered emails, switching when the baby grew fussy, sharing the small discoveries that marked Oliver's rapid development. He was starting to track movement with his eyes. His grip was surprisingly strong. He made tiny sounds that weren't quite coos but weren't cries either. I've been thinking about what you said, Lachlan said during one of their exchanges, as Hollis settled Oliver against her shoulder, about biology not making someone a father. It's true. Hollis's voice held no malice, just matter-of-fact certainty. My dad wasn't my biological father. He married my mom when I was 2, adopted me when I was 5. But he was the one who taught me to ride a bike, helped with homework, scared away monsters under my bed. He was my father in every way that mattered. Lachlan absorbed this information, another piece of Hollis's puzzle clicking into place. He'd known she was close to her father before he died, but he'd never known about the adoption. What made him stay? Lachlan asked, when he could have walked away from someone else's responsibility. Love, Hollis said simply. He loved my mother and eventually he loved me. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. Every day. The weight of that choice, daily, deliberate, unglamorous love, settled between them. Lachlan had spent his adult life making dramatic gestures, closing million-dollar deals, building an empire that would outlast him. But fatherhood, apparently, was built from small moments and consistent presence. I want to learn, he said quietly. How to change diapers, how to do the night feedings, all of it. I know I missed the beginning, but I don't want to miss anything else. Hollis studied his face, searching for the catch, the hidden agenda, the business strategy disguised as parental devotion. Instead, she saw something she'd rarely witnessed in their marriage. Uncertainty. Lachlan Vance, master of the universe, admitting he didn't know how to do something. It's not romantic, she warned. Babies are messy and loud and completely irrational. You can't negotiate with them or optimize their processes. They don't care about your schedule or your quarterly projections. I'm beginning to understand that. Oliver chose that moment to demonstrate his complete indifference to adult conversation by exploding his diaper with impressive force. The sound echoed through the coffee shop, followed immediately by a smell that made several nearby customers relocate. "And that," Hollis said, standing to gather supplies from the diaper bag, "is your first lesson in practical fatherhood. How are you with biological hazards?" Lachlan looked down at Oliver, who was now crying with the righteous indignation of someone who had just made a significant mess and expected immediate resolution. "I built a tech empire from nothing," Lachlan said, rolling up his sleeves. "How hard can one baby be?" The question would haunt him 15 minutes later, as he stood in the coffee shop's tiny bathroom, covered in substances he'd never encountered in any boardroom, while Oliver screamed like his diaper change was a personal betrayal. Hollis coached him through the process with the patience of someone teaching calculus to a particularly slow student. "Lift his legs. No, both legs. Okay. Now slide the clean diaper under. Lachlan, you need to move faster. He's about to—" Too late. Oliver demonstrated his impressive range, and Lachlan found himself wearing yet another bodily fluid. "This is harder than mergers and acquisitions," Lachlan muttered, trying to clean both himself and Oliver while the baby continued his protests. "Welcome to the real world," Hollis said, but she was smiling now, the first genuine smile she'd given him since his arrival in Portland. "Still think you want to learn?" Lachlan looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His expensive sweater was ruined, his hair was disheveled, and he smelled like a daycare center after a particularly challenging day. 3 weeks ago, this scenario would have sent him fleeing back to his sterile, controlled world of profit margins and strategic planning. But Oliver had finally stopped crying and was looking at him with those solemn gray eyes, and something fundamental had shifted in Lachlan's chest. This was messy and difficult, and completely outside his expertise, and for the first time in years, he was exactly where he wanted to be. "Ask me in about 18 years, he said, lifting his son carefully into his arms. "But right now, I'm not going anywhere." Outside the bathroom, the coffee shop had mostly cleared out, but neither parent noticed. They were too busy discovering that love, unlike business, couldn't be rushed or optimized. It could only be lived, one imperfect moment at a time. 2 weeks into their careful dance of shared parenting, Hollis found herself in the most unlikely of places, standing in the rain outside Lachlan's hotel at 2:47 a.m., holding a screaming Oliver who had been inconsolable for 3 hours. She'd tried everything: feeding, changing, swaddling, the special bouncing technique that usually worked, even the hairdryer sound that her pediatrician had recommended. Nothing. Oliver's cries had reached the level where Mrs. Patterson next door had knocked on the wall in polite protest, and Hollis had realized she was completely out of solutions. The Nines Hotel downtown was exactly what she'd expected: sleek glass and steel, the kind of place where doormen wore better suits than most people owned. At this hour, the lobby was nearly empty except for a night clerk, who looked startled to see a disheveled woman in pajama pants and rain boots carrying a wailing infant. "I'm here to see Lachlan Vance," Hollis told him, raising her voice over Oliver's protests. I don't actually know his room number." The clerk's expression shifted from confusion to recognition. "Mr. Vance mentioned he might have a late visitor. Penthouse suite. I'll call up." 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened to reveal Lachlan in gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt, his hair sleep mussed and his eyes immediately alert despite the hour. He took in the scene: Hollis's exhausted face, her soaked jacket, Oliver's red-faced fury, and stepped aside without a word. "I'm sorry," Hollis said as she entered the suite, which was probably larger than her entire apartment. "I know this violates our agreement about scheduled visits, but he won't stop crying and I don't know what else to try, and my neighbor has work in the morning." "Hey." Lachlan's voice was gentle as he reached for Oliver. "It's okay. Let me try." The baby's cries didn't diminish as he changed hands, but something interesting happened. Lachlan began walking in a specific pattern, not the random pacing most people defaulted to, but a measured, rhythmic movement that seemed almost choreographed. "Where did you learn to do that?" Hollis asked, watching him navigate the suite's open floor plan with surprising confidence. "I've been researching," Lachlan admitted, his voice slightly raised over Oliver's protests. "There are patterns that mimic womb movement. The infinity walk is supposed to be particularly effective for colicky babies. You've been researching baby-soothing techniques? I've been researching everything." He adjusted Oliver's position, supporting his head with practiced ease that would have been impossible 2 weeks ago. Infant development, sleep patterns, feeding schedules, The neurological basis for crying. Did you know that babies have different cries for different needs? This isn't hunger or discomfort. This is overstimulation. Hollis stared at him. You learn to distinguish between types of crying? I bought 17 books, watched about 40 hours of videos. There's this pediatrician in Seattle who has a whole series on infant communication patterns. Lachlan continued his infinity walk, and slowly, miraculously, Oliver's cries began to subside. I also may have hired a night nanny consultant to teach me proper swaddling techniques. You hired a consultant for swaddling. Her name is Margaret. She's worked with 3 royal families and has very strong opinions about muslin versus cotton blankets. Lachlan's tone was matter-of-fact, as if hiring experts to teach him basic parenting skills was the most natural thing in the world. She also taught me the shush-pat method, which works better when combined with specific positioning. He demonstrated, adjusting Oliver into a slightly different hold while maintaining the walking pattern. The baby's cries reduced to soft whimpers, then to the kind of hiccuping size that suggested approaching sleep. This is insane, Hollis said, sinking onto the suite's plush sofa. 3 weeks ago, you couldn't hold him without looking terrified. Now you're some kind of baby whisperer? I'm a fast learner when I'm motivated. Lachlan continued his careful movement, Oliver's eyes finally beginning to drift closed. And I've never been more motivated by anything in my life. The suite fell into blessed quiet except for the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows and Oliver's gradually deepening breathing. Hollis looked around the space properly for the first time. It was beautiful in the way expensive things always were, but it also looked lived in. There were baby care books stacked on the coffee table, printed articles about infant development scattered across the dining table, and what appeared to be a high-end baby monitor system set up near the bedroom. Lachlan, please tell me you didn't buy baby gear for a hotel room. Just the basics, he said. But his definition of basics apparently included a top-of-the-line sound machine, a professional-grade air purifier, and what looked like a designer-changing pad laid out on the bedroom's sitting area. This is crazy. You know that, right? Normal people don't turn hotel suites into nurseries. Nothing about this situation is normal. Lachlan had successfully navigated Oliver into deep sleep, but he continued the gentle walking motion. I'm a father who missed the first 3 weeks of his son's life because I was too proud and too stupid to fight for what mattered. Now I'm trying to compress months of preparation into days of practice. You can't optimize parenting like it's a business process. I'm not trying to optimize it. I'm trying to be worthy of it. He stopped walking and looked at her directly. Do you want to know what I did the day after I found you? I called my mother. This was a revelation. In 4 years of marriage, Lachlan had mentioned his mother exactly 3 times, and never in detail. Hollis knew she lived in Seattle, that she'd remarried when Lachlan was young, and that their relationship was complicated in the way wealthy family relationships often were. I haven't spoken to her in 2 years, Lachlan continued, but I called her and told her she had a grandson. And do you know what she said? Hollis shook her head. She said, I hope you don't mess this up the way you messed up everything else. Lachlan's smile was rueful. Then she drove down here and spent 6 hours teaching me how to properly support a baby's head, change diapers without creating a biological disaster, and recognize the early signs of overstimulation. Your mother came to Portland? She's staying at the Heathman. Wants to meet Oliver when you're ready. Apparently she's been waiting years for me to produce a grandchild she could spoil properly. He paused. She also asked about you. Wanted to know if I'd apologized adequately for being an emotionally stunted workaholic. And what did you tell her? That adequate didn't begin to cover it. That I'd spent 8 months telling myself you were better off without me, when really I was just afraid to admit how empty my life had become without you in it. The honesty of the statement hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Oliver slept peacefully in his father's arms, oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening around him. I brought you here once, Hollis said quietly, looking around the suite. For our 2nd anniversary. You had a business dinner that ran late, so I waited in the bar downstairs for 3 hours, drinking overpriced wine and pretending I wasn't embarrassed that my husband had forgotten our anniversary dinner. Lachlan's face fell. Hollis, You apologized. Sent flowers to my office for a week. Bought me that diamond bracelet I never wore because it felt like a guilt purchase. She tucked her legs under her on the sofa. But you never asked why I stayed in that bar for 3 hours instead of just going home. Why did you? Because I kept hoping you'd remember. That something would click, and you'd realize where you were supposed to be. She watched Oliver's peaceful face, so perfectly relaxed in his father's arms. I kept thinking that if I just waited long enough, you'd choose me. The words were a knife through Lachlan's chest. I always chose you. In my mind, everything I was building was for us, for our future. No, Hollis interrupted gently. You chose the idea of us. You chose the version of me that fit into your 5-year plan. But you never chose the actual me, standing in hotel bars and coffee shops in our own kitchen, asking you to be present for the life we were actually living. Lachlan looked down at Oliver, whose existence was proof of all the moments he'd missed, all the choices he'd made wrong. I don't know how to fix that. I don't know how to prove that I understand the difference now. You can't fix it, Hollis said simply, but maybe you can do better. Maybe we can figure out how to build something new instead of trying to repair something that was broken from the start. What would that look like? I don't know. Co-parenting that works. Friendship, maybe. A way for Oliver to have both his parents without us destroying each other in the process. It wasn't a declaration of love or a pathway back to marriage, but it was something. It was possibility. I'd like that, Lachlan said. I'd like to try. Then stop treating this like a project you can master in 2 weeks. Stop hiring consultants and buying equipment and trying to prove you're ready. Just be here. Show up. Let it be messy and imperfect and impossible to control. As if summoned by her words, Oliver stirred and made a soft sound of protest. Not crying, just a gentle reminder that he was still there, still needing them both. I should probably take him home, Hollis said, though she made no move to get up. He'll be hungry again soon. Stay, Lachlan said quietly. Please. It's late. You're exhausted and I have everything he needs here. Take the bed. I'll sleep on the couch. It was a practical suggestion that felt anything but practical. Staying meant crossing boundaries they'd carefully established. It meant trusting him not just with Oliver, but with her own vulnerability. Just for tonight, she agreed finally. But this doesn't change anything between us. I know, Lachlan said, though they both understood that everything had already changed the moment she'd shown up at his door in the rain, needing him to help soothe their son. Some bridges, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Hollis woke to the sound of Oliver's hungry cries and the unfamiliar luxury of Egyptian cotton sheets. For a disorienting moment she couldn't place where she was. Then the events of the previous night rushed back. The hotel, Lachlan's surprising competence, the conversation that had felt like walking through a minefield of old wounds. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing downtown Portland spread out below like a miniature city. She could hear Lachlan's voice from the sitting area, speaking in the gentle tones he'd developed for Oliver. I know. You're hungry and your mother is being lazy, but she needs sleep, little man. She's been taking care of you all by herself for 5 weeks now. Hollis padded to the doorway, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and found Lachlan seated in an armchair with Oliver against his shoulder. He'd changed into fresh clothes, dark jeans and a gray Henley that made him look younger, more approachable than the corporate titan she'd married. How long has he been awake? She asked, voice rough with sleep. About 20 minutes. I was hoping you'd get another hour, but he's pretty insistent about breakfast. Lachlan stood carefully, supporting Oliver's head with the practiced ease that still surprised her. There's coffee. I had room service bring up some of those pastries you used to like from Pearl Bakery. The casual mention of her preferences, remembered after all this time, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. You remember what I like from Pearl Bakery? I remember everything about you, Hollis. That was never the problem. The admission hung between them as she took Oliver and settled into the chair to feed him. Lachlan moved to the kitchenette, giving her privacy while staying close enough to continue their conversation. Your mother, Hollis said as Oliver latched on. When do I get to meet the woman who raised the most stubborn man in Silicon Valley? She wants to take us to lunch today. If you're up for it. Lachlan returned with coffee and a plate of pastries, setting them within her reach. I should warn you, she's intense, and she has very strong opinions about how I handled our marriage. All of them negative, I'm guessing? She used the phrase emotionally constipated several times during our conversation. Hollis nearly choked on her coffee. I like her already. They were settling into an easy rhythm, the kind of domestic morning that had been rare even during their marriage, when Lachlan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his entire demeanor shifted. What is it? Hollis asked, noting the way his jaw tightened. Work. Nothing that can't wait. But the phone buzzed again. Then again. Lachlan reached for it with obvious reluctance. Take it, Hollis said quietly. I know that look. It won't stop until you do. I told Marcus I wasn't to be disturbed unless... "Lachlan, take the call." He answered with his usual efficient greeting, but within seconds his voice had taken on the hard edge she remembered from their worst fights. "What do you mean the Singapore deal is falling apart? I specifically said that Nakamura-san was not to be approached without my approval." Hollis watched the transformation with familiar dread. The gentle man who'd soothed their crying baby was disappearing, replaced by the corporate predator who'd built an empire on calculated aggression. "No," Lachlan said, running his free hand through his hair. "Absolutely not. Schedule an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. I'll fly out tonight." "Tonight?" Hollis's voice came out sharper than intended. Lachlan looked at her, phone still pressed to his ear, and she saw the exact moment he realized what he'd just said, the choice he'd just made. Again. "Marcus, let me call you back." He ended the call and set the phone down like it was radioactive. "Hollis, I can explain." "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. Less than 12 hours after promising you'd do better, you're getting on a plane to Singapore. It's a $15 billion acquisition. If I don't handle this personally, 2 years of work disappears. And what about this? She gestured between them, including Oliver in her sweep. "What about the work you're supposed to be doing here? I'll be back in a week, 10 days at most. This doesn't change anything." "This changes everything." Hollis stood abruptly, Oliver still in her arms. "Do you hear yourself? You sound exactly like you did 8 months ago. The deal, the company, the empire, that's more important than anything else. That's not fair. This isn't about choosing work over family. This is about protecting what I've built so I can provide for our son. Our son needs a father, not a trust fund. He can have both, not if his father is always on a plane to the next crisis, the next merger, the next thing that's supposedly more urgent than being present for his child's life." Lachlan's phone buzzed again. This time he ignored it, but the damage was done. The moment had been shattered by the intrusion of his other life, his real life, the one that had always mattered more than the people who loved him. "I have responsibilities," he said quietly. "Thousands of employees, shareholders, contracts worth billions. And you have a son who's 5 weeks old and a woman who—" Hollis stopped herself before she could finish the sentence. What was she? His ex-wife? The mother of his child? Someone foolish enough to believe that one night of tenderness meant anything had actually changed? A woman who what? Lachlan stepped closer, his gray eyes searching her face. "Nothing. A woman who should have known better than to think you'd actually changed." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. "That's not true. Everything I've done these past 2 weeks has been on your terms and your timeline when it was convenient for your schedule. But the moment your real life called, you were ready to abandon this one." Again, Oliver, sensing the tension in his mother's voice, began to fuss. Hollis automatically started the bouncing motion that calmed him, but her eyes never left Lachlan's face. "I didn't abandon anything. I'm trying to balance." "There is no balance with you, Lachlan. There's your empire, and then there's everything else fighting for scraps of your attention. I won't put Oliver through that. I won't put myself through it again." "So what are you saying?" Hollis looked around the luxurious suite, at the baby gear he'd purchased, the books he'd studied, the careful preparation that had made her believe, for just a moment, that he might actually prioritize being a father over being a mogul. "I'm saying that supervised visits were the right idea. 2 hours 3 times a week with clear boundaries. No more nights like this, no more pretending we're building something when you're just killing time between business trips. Hollis, please, let me handle Singapore and then we can—" "No." Her voice was firm, final. "Handle Singapore. Handle whatever crisis comes after that, and the one after that. But don't ask me to pretend that Oliver and I are anything more than items on your very long to-do list." She gathered her things quickly, efficiently, Oliver secure in her arms. Lachlan watched helplessly as she prepared to leave, knowing that anything he said would only prove her point. "I'll call you when I get back," he said as she reached the door. "You'll call Marcus first," Hollis replied without turning around. "And your assistant, and probably 3 board members. I'll be 4th or 5th on the list, assuming there isn't another crisis by then." "That's not—" "Goodbye, Lachlan." She left him standing in a suite filled with baby gear and abandoned coffee cups, his phone buzzing insistently on the table like a reminder of the choice he'd already made. 15 minutes later, alone in the elevator descending to the lobby, Hollis let herself cry for the future she'd been foolish enough to imagine. Oliver slept peacefully against her shoulder, unaware that his parents had just proven once again that love wasn't always enough to bridge the gap between who someone could be and who they chose to be. Outside, Portland's morning rain had started again, washing the city clean for another day. Hollis pulled Oliver's blanket higher and stepped into it, carrying her son home to the small, imperfect apartment where she was learning that sometimes the best love you could give someone was letting them go. Behind her, 40 stories up, Lachlan Vance stood at his window watching them disappear into the crowd, his phone already ringing with the demands of an empire that would never love him back. 12 days. That's how long Lachlan had been gone, and Hollis had stopped counting after day 10. Singapore had turned into Tokyo, then Hong Kong, then back to Silicon Valley for critical meetings that apparently couldn't be handled remotely. His text messages had grown shorter and less frequent until they stopped altogether 3 days ago. Oliver, blissfully unaware of his father's absence, had reached a new milestone. He was starting to smile in response to voices and faces, tiny expressions of joy that should have been shared with both parents. Instead, Hollis found herself taking photos to send to Lachlan, then deleting them before hitting send. What was the point? He was building his empire, while she was building their son's foundations of trust and security. She was uploading those same photos to her private Instagram account, the one only her closest friends could see, when her phone rang. Unknown number, but the area code was local. Hollis, this is Eleanor Vance, Lachlan's mother. Hollis nearly dropped her phone. Mrs. Vance, hello? Please call me Eleanor, and I'm calling because my son is an idiot. Despite everything, Hollis found herself smiling. That's direct. I'm 72 years old, dear. I don't have time for subtlety. Eleanor's voice carried the refined authority of someone accustomed to being heard. I've been in Portland for 2 weeks waiting to meet my grandson, and instead I've watched my son repeat every mistake that destroyed his marriage. May I buy you lunch? An hour later, Hollis sat across from Eleanor Vance in a quiet corner of Le Pigeon, one of Portland's most elegant restaurants. Lachlan's mother was exactly what Hollis had expected. Silver hair styled in a perfect bob, designer clothes that whispered rather than shouted wealth, and intelligent gray eyes that were disconcertingly familiar. Oliver slept peacefully in his car seat, having charmed the maitre d' and half the waitstaff on their way to the table. He's beautiful, Eleanor said, her stern expression softening as she looked at her grandson. He has Lachlan's stubborn chin but your gentle eyes. Hopefully he inherited your common sense as well. Thank you for wanting to meet him, Hollis said carefully. I wasn't sure, given the circumstances. The circumstances are that my son is a brilliant man who consistently makes terrible personal decisions. Eleanor sipped her wine with the precision of someone who'd perfected the art of elegant disappointment. Tell me what happened 12 days ago. Hollis related the story. The night at the hotel, the morning that had felt like possibility, the phone call that had shattered everything. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. Singapore, Eleanor said finally with the tone others might use for a particularly virulent disease. Do you know what happened with that acquisition? I assume he saved it. He always does. He lost it. Eleanor's smile was sharp as a blade. Completely. $15 billion down the drain because he spent 2 weeks in Portland learning to be a father instead of managing his business properly. The board is furious. There's talk of a vote of no confidence. Hollis stared at her. He lost the deal? Spectacularly. Apparently his attention was elsewhere during the crucial negotiations. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. The irony, of course, is that for the first time in his adult life, Lachlan's priorities were actually in the right place. But old habits die hard, and the moment crisis struck, he reverted to form. I don't understand. If he lost the deal anyway, why didn't he come back? Because he's ashamed. Because admitting failure has never been in my son's vocabulary. And because he's probably convinced himself that you and Oliver are better off without him dragging you down into his professional disasters. The waiter appeared to take their orders, but Hollis barely noticed the interruption. Her mind was reeling. Lachlan had lost the deal. The empire he'd chosen over his family was crumbling, and he was too proud to come home and admit it. There's something else, Eleanor continued once they were alone again. Something I think you should know about Lachlan's father. This was uncharted territory. In 4 years of marriage, Lachlan had barely mentioned his biological father, deflecting questions with the same precision he used to avoid other uncomfortable topics. Richard Vance was brilliant, Eleanor began. Absolutely brilliant. He built Vance-Tech's predecessor from nothing, turned it into one of the most innovative companies on the West Coast. But he was also completely incapable of being present for anything that didn't involve profit margins and market analysis. Oliver stirred in his car seat, and Eleanor automatically reached over to gently rock him back to sleep. The gesture was so natural, so grandmotherly, that it almost broke Hollis's heart. Richard missed Lachlan's birth because he was in a board meeting in Tokyo, missed his first steps because of a conference in Geneva. By the time Lachlan was 5, Richard was more stranger than father. He'd show up with expensive gifts and grand promises, then disappear for weeks or months at a time. What happened to him? Heart attack at 54. Died at his desk, working on a presentation that was supposed to secure the future of his company. Eleanor's voice grew soft. Lachlan was 14, old enough to understand that his father had chosen work over family until the very end, old enough to swear he'd never be like that. The pieces began falling into place. Lachlan's relentless drive, his inability to separate personal worth from professional achievement, his terror of being vulnerable or dependent on anything he couldn't control. He's been running from his father's ghost his entire life, Eleanor continued, building something bigger, something more permanent, convinced that if he could just achieve enough, create enough, control enough, he'd prove he was different. But the sad truth is he became exactly what he feared most. Then why did he marry me? Why risk having a child if he knew he'd repeat the pattern? Eleanor smiled, and for the first time, it held genuine warmth. Because for 4 years, you made him believe he could be different. You were the only person who ever made him want to be present instead of powerful. But it wasn't enough. Love is never enough on its own, dear. It takes choice. Daily, deliberate choice. And Lachlan has spent 39 years learning to choose wrong. Their food arrived, but neither woman touched it immediately. Oliver had awakened and was making the soft sounds that meant he'd be hungry soon. Hollis lifted him from his car seat, settling him against her shoulder with practiced ease. He's going to lose Vance Tech, Eleanor said quietly. The board meeting is tomorrow. They're voting on his removal as CEO. Hollis's breath caught. He doesn't know you're telling me this. He doesn't know I'm in Portland. He thinks I went back to Seattle after he left for Singapore. Eleanor finally picked up her fork, though she seemed more interested in rearranging her salad than eating it. I stayed because I wanted to meet my grandson, and because I hoped he might finally choose differently this time. What do you want from me? Nothing, Eleanor said simply. I'm not asking you to save him or forgive him or take him back. God knows he doesn't deserve it. I'm just telling you the truth about why he runs in case it matters to your understanding of who he is beneath all that stubborn pride. Oliver began rooting against Hollis's shoulder, his way of announcing that lunch was required immediately. She adjusted her sweater, preparing to feed him when Eleanor stood. I should go. But Hollis? She paused, gathering her purse with elegant efficiency. Whatever you decide about Lachlan, don't let his failings rob Oliver of the chance to know his father. Children need their parents, even the imperfect ones, especially the imperfect ones. She leaned down to kiss Oliver's forehead gently, then straightened to look at Hollis. You're a remarkable young woman. My son was lucky to have you even if he was too foolish to deserve you. And Oliver will be lucky to have you as his mother, no matter what else happens. Eleanor left with the same refined grace she'd brought to their meeting, leaving Hollis alone with a sleeping baby and a head full of revelations that changed nothing and everything about the man who'd fathered her child. Outside the restaurant windows, Portland's afternoon light was beginning to fade, and somewhere across the country, Lachlan Vance was probably sitting in another sterile conference room, fighting a battle he'd already lost while the people who actually mattered waited for him to remember where home was supposed to be. Hollis looked down at Oliver, whose perfect face reflected the best of both his parents, and wondered if love and understanding would ever be enough to break a cycle that had been 39 years in the making. The call came at 3:17 a.m. Pacific time. Hollis had been awake anyway, feeding Oliver in the soft glow of her apartment's single lamp, when her phone buzzed with a number she recognized but hadn't expected to see. Marcus Chen, Lachlan's head of security, calling at an hour that meant either emergency or disaster. Hollis? I'm sorry to wake you, but what happened? She shifted Oliver to her shoulder, already knowing that whatever Marcus was about to tell her would change everything. The board voted tonight. Emergency session. Lachlan's been removed as CEO of Vance Tech effective immediately. The words hit her like ice water. She'd known this was coming. Eleanor had warned her, but hearing it confirmed felt like watching a controlled demolition. 20 years of building, gone in a single vote. Where is he? She asked. That's why I'm calling. No one knows. He left the boardroom after the vote and hasn't been seen since. His phone's going straight to voicemail. Hotel says he never checked out, but he's not in his room. Security footage shows him leaving the Vance Tech building around midnight, but after that, Marcus's voice carried the strain of someone who'd spent hours searching for his missing boss. You think he's coming here? I think he's finally realized what matters. Question is whether he'll act on it or just disappear completely. Oliver had fallen back asleep against her shoulder, his tiny body warm and trusting. Hollis looked around her small apartment, the life she'd built without Lachlan, the peace she'd found in routine and simplicity. Part of her hoped he wouldn't come. Part of her had been waiting for this call since the day he'd left for Singapore. If you hear from him, Marcus continued, he's going to need... Marcus? A familiar voice interrupted in the background. Is that Hollis? Eleanor Vance. Of course she was there. Hollis should have known that Lachlan's mother would be waiting in the wings for this moment. Put her on, Hollis said. My dear. Eleanor's voice was tired but unsurprised. I assume Marcus told you about the vote? Where do you think he went? Honestly, I'm not sure. This is uncharted territory for Lachlan. He's never failed at anything this spectacularly before. Eleanor paused, and Hollis could hear the weight of a mother's worry. The Lachlan I know would already be planning his next empire, his comeback strategy. But lately I'm not sure I know who my son is becoming. What do you mean? He's been different since Portland. Distracted, yes, but also more present somehow. As if seeing Oliver woke something up in him that had been sleeping for decades. The board noticed it too. Said he seemed unfocused during crucial negotiations. Hollis closed her eyes. So his attention to fatherhood had cost him his empire. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. There's something else, Eleanor continued. Something I probably should have mentioned at lunch yesterday. Lachlan liquidated a significant portion of his personal assets 3 weeks ago. Moved the money into a trust fund for Oliver. He what? $200 million, placed in an irrevocable trust. Oliver can access it when he turns 25, but until then, it's managed by an independent firm. Lachlan can't touch it even if he wanted to. Hollis sank into her reading chair, Oliver still sleeping peacefully in her arms. $200 million. For a son Lachlan had known existed for less than a month. Why would he do that? Because whatever else my son is, he's not stupid. He knew the Singapore deal was falling apart. Knew the board was losing confidence, and he wanted to make sure Oliver would be provided for no matter what happened to Vance Tech. The sacrifice was staggering. Lachlan had essentially given away a fortune to secure his son's future, all while knowing it might not be enough to save his own company. Eleanor, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest. Do you think he's coming back to Portland? I think, Eleanor said carefully, that my son is sitting somewhere right now, probably in his car in some anonymous parking lot, trying to decide whether he's brave enough to face the people he's disappointed, whether he's worthy of asking for forgiveness he doesn't deserve. And what do you think? I think he spent his entire adult life believing that his value came from what he could provide, rather than who he could be. Tonight he lost the ability to provide anything except himself. For Lachlan, that might feel like showing up empty-handed. After the call ended, Hollis found herself unable to return to sleep. She moved to her small kitchen, Oliver still contentedly dozing, and made coffee she didn't want just to have something to do with her hands. The apartment felt different in the pre-dawn darkness. Smaller somehow, more fragile, as if the news of Lachlan's professional destruction had shifted the very foundation of the life she'd built without him. At 5:30 a.m., Oliver woke demanding breakfast, and Hollis settled into their routine of feeding and gentle conversation. She told him about his father as she had every morning since his birth, narrating a relationship Oliver was too young to understand, but old enough to absorb through her voice. Your daddy made some big mistakes, she whispered as he fed. But he loves you very much, and sometimes love means making sacrifices that don't make sense to anyone else. At 6:15, there was a soft knock on her door. Hollis's heart stopped. She knew, without looking, who would be standing in her hallway. The question was whether she was ready to face him. She wrapped Oliver in his favorite blanket and went to the door, pausing with her hand on the deadbolt. Through the peephole, she could see Lachlan leaning against the opposite wall, still wearing the expensive suit from his board meeting but looking like he'd slept in his car. His hair was disheveled, his tie hung loose around his neck, and his usually perfect posture had collapsed into something that looked dangerously close to defeat. Hollis opened the door. They stared at each other across the threshold, and she could see the exact moment he registered Oliver in her arms. His entire face transformed. the corporate mask slipping away to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. I lost everything, he said quietly. Vance Tech, the board's confidence, probably half my net worth by the time the lawsuits are finished. I have no company, no prospects, and no plan for what comes next. I know, Hollis said simply. Marcus called you. Your mother called Marcus. It's quite a chain of communication you've got going. Despite everything, Lachlan's mouth quirked in the shadow of a smile. She always did like to manage family crises from behind the scenes. They stood there for a moment, Oliver the only sound between them as he made soft, sleepy noises against Hollis's shoulder. Can I come in? Lachlan asked finally. I know I don't have the right to ask, but you look like hell, Hollis interrupted, stepping aside to let him enter. When's the last time you slept? Tuesday, I think. Maybe Monday. He moved into her small living room like a man navigating foreign territory. It's been a long week. Sit down before you fall down. Lachlan collapsed onto her second-hand sofa with the boneless exhaustion of someone who'd finally stopped running. Hollis studied his face, the dark circles under his eyes, the new lines of stress around his mouth, the way his hands shook slightly as he raked them through his hair. Oliver's been asking about you, she said, settling into the chair across from him. He can't possibly. I talk to him about you every day, about his daddy who's working very hard but loves him very much. I figured he should know your voice when you decided to come back. The simple statement broke something in Lachlan's carefully constructed armor. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked fragile. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. How to be a father, how to be worthy of either of you, how to build a life that isn't based on conquering and acquiring and proving I'm stronger than everyone else. Start with being here, Hollis said gently. Just be here. Outside, Portland was waking up. The soft sounds of neighbors leaving for work, children calling to friends, the ordinary rhythm of people living ordinary lives. It was the kind of life Lachlan had never learned to value, but sitting in Hollis's small apartment with his son sleeping peacefully nearby, he began to understand why some victories were worth more than others. I set up a trust fund for Oliver, he said suddenly. $200 million. He'll never have to worry about money no matter what happens to me. I heard. Hollis adjusted Oliver's blanket, not looking at Lachlan directly. That was a good thing to do. It was selfish. I wanted to make sure I could provide for him even if I couldn't be the father he deserved. And now I'm hoping money won't be enough, that maybe showing up, being present, choosing him every day might matter more than a trust fund. It was the right answer, but Hollis had heard right answers from him before. The question was whether this time, stripped of his empire and his illusions, Lachlan was finally ready to back up his words with the harder work of actually being present. We'll see, she said simply, and in those two words lay both possibility and warning. Outside, the sun was fully up now, painting her small apartment in warm golden light, and for the first time in weeks, all three members of their fractured family were in the same room, trying to figure out if love could be rebuilt from the ashes of everything that had come before. 3 months later, Lachlan Vance was learning that poverty was relative. He stood in the cramped kitchen of his one-bedroom apartment in southeast Portland, a far cry from his penthouse suite but close enough to Hollis and Oliver for daily visits, attempting to make scrambled eggs that wouldn't qualify as a biological hazard. The apartment came furnished with items that charitable people might call vintage, and honest people would call second-hand. But it was his, paid for with the remnants of his personal savings after lawyers and settlements and the spectacular financial implosion of his former life. His phone buzzed with yet another call from a headhunter promising to rebuild his career, and for the third time that morning he let it go to voicemail. 6 weeks ago, those calls would have been lifelines. Now they felt like invitations back to a prison he'd finally escaped. At precisely 9 a.m., there was a knock on his door. Punctual as always, Oliver was arriving for their morning routine, something that had evolved naturally from supervised visits to shared breakfast, to what now resembled actual co-parenting. Lachlan opened the door to find Hollis holding Oliver, both of them bundled against Portland's October chill. At 3 months old, Oliver had discovered the power of his smile, and he deployed it immediately upon seeing his father. "Good morning, little man," Lachlan said, automatically reaching for his son. The transfer had become seamless over the weeks, a dance of practiced parenthood that still amazed him. How was the night? 2 feedings, 1 explosive diaper, and what I'm pretty sure was his first attempt at rolling over. Hollis stepped into the apartment, noting the breakfast disaster waiting in the kitchen. Please tell me you're not trying to cook again. I'm expanding my culinary skills beyond ordering takeout. Your culinary skills currently include burning water and setting off smoke alarms with toast. She moved past him toward the kitchen, the familiarity of the gesture both comfortable and dangerous. Go sit with Oliver. I'll fix this before you poison us all. It had become their routine. Lachlan would attempt basic domestic tasks, fail spectacularly, and Hollis would quietly fix his mistakes while pretending not to notice his complete incompetence at ordinary life. In return, he'd spend hours holding Oliver, reading to him from age-inappropriate business journals, and learning the precise timing of his son's naps. They hadn't discussed what this arrangement was becoming. Labels felt too risky, too loaded with the weight of their shared history. Instead, they existed in a careful bubble of present-tense cooperation, focused entirely on Oliver's needs and pointedly ignoring the growing electricity between them. "There's coffee," Lachlan called from the living room where he'd settled into the apartment's single armchair with Oliver against his chest. "Real coffee, not the instant stuff." "Small miracles," Hollis replied, though he could hear the smile in her voice. Through the kitchen doorway, he watched her move with efficient grace, turning his breakfast catastrophe into something resembling actual food. She'd tied her auburn hair back in a messy bun, and she was wearing the green sweater that made her eyes look like sea glass. Domestic Hollis was somehow even more beautiful than the polished version he'd married. More real, more grounded, more utterly herself. "Lachlan?" Her voice carried a note of concern that snapped him back to attention. "Sorry. Wool gathering. I said your mother called me yesterday." This was news. Since his fall from grace, Eleanor had maintained strategic distance from the drama, claiming she was letting the children work things out themselves. Her sudden reappearance in their carefully constructed routine felt ominous. "What did she want?" "To inform me that you've been refusing job offers. Apparently 3 different companies have made you CEO offers in the past month." Lachlan adjusted Oliver's position, buying time. "That's not entirely accurate." "Which part?" "They weren't really offers. They were fishing expeditions. Companies hoping to capitalize on the Vance Tech scandal by hiring the fallen prince at a discount." Hollis emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 plates of what looked like actual breakfast. She set one on the coffee table in front of him and settled onto the couch with her own. "Eleanor seems to think you're having some kind of crisis of purpose." Her exact words were, "existential collapse masquerading as paternal devotion. My mother has never been accused of subtlety. She's worried about you. We both are." The casual inclusion of herself in that concern made something warm unfurl in Lachlan's chest. "I'm fine. You're living in an apartment that's smaller than your old closet, cooking with appliances that should probably be condemned, and turning down opportunities to rebuild your career. That's not fine. That's hiding." Oliver chose that moment to spit up on Lachlan's shirt, his last clean shirt as it happened. Without missing a beat, Hollis handed him a burp cloth, and he cleaned himself off with the resignation of someone who'd learned that baby bodily fluids were an occupational hazard of parenthood. "I'm not hiding," he said finally. "I'm choosing differently." Choosing what? The question hung between them like a challenge. Lachlan looked down at Oliver, who was studying his father's face with the intense concentration that had become his trademark expression. Choosing him. Choosing to be here for the rolling over and the first smiles in the middle of the night feedings. Choosing to learn who he is instead of building an empire for him to inherit. "And what about your life? Your career? Everything you built?" "Everything I built was a monument to my own insecurity. A way to prove I was worthy of love without ever risking being vulnerable enough to accept it." He met her eyes directly. "Vance Tech is gone. The board, the shareholders, the billion-dollar deals, all of it. And you know what? I sleep better now than I have in 20 years. Hollis studied his face, searching for the lie, the hidden agenda, the inevitable moment when he'd realized that ordinary life wasn't enough for someone who'd commanded an empire. "What happens when this gets old?" she asked quietly. "When the novelty of playing house wears off and you remember that you're Lachlan Vance, master of the universe? What happens when you realize that I'm not playing?" The words carried weight neither of them was ready to examine. Oliver stirred against his father's chest, making the soft sounds that meant he was transitioning between sleep and wakefulness. "I should probably head to work," Hollis said, though she made no move to get up. "Oliver's babysitter will be here soon." "Actually," Lachlan said carefully, "I was hoping we could talk about that." "About what?" "About me watching him during the day. Full time." Hollis nearly choked on her coffee. "You want to be Oliver's primary caregiver?" "I want to be his father. All day, every day. Feedings, diaper changes, naps, tummy time, all of it. Lachlan's voice grew more confident as he outlined his proposal. You work, I'll parent. It's a better arrangement than daycare, and frankly, I need something to do with my days besides avoiding headhunters and learning to cook. Lachlan, you've been a father for 6 weeks. Taking care of a baby full-time is terrifying, exhausting, completely outside my skill set. He smiled, and for the first time in months it reached his eyes. Sounds like the most important job I've ever applied for. Hollis looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she'd never seen before in their relationship. Peace. Not the manic satisfaction of closing a deal or the brittle pride of winning a corporate battle, but genuine contentment. What about when he's older? When you get bored of diaper changes and start missing the challenge of building something significant? I am building something significant, Lachlan said simply. I'm building a relationship with my son. I'm building trust with the woman He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but the words hung in the air between them anyway. The woman you what? The woman who gave me the greatest gift I've ever received, even when I was too stupid to deserve it. Oliver woke fully then, blinking up at his parents with the solemn intelligence that made him seem far older than his 7 weeks. As if on cue, he smiled. Not the reflexive expressions of his early days, but a genuine, responsive smile that lit up his entire face. He's deciding, Hollis said softly. Deciding what? Whether you're worthy of being his full-time dad. As if he'd understood the conversation, Oliver reached up with one tiny fist and grabbed onto Lachlan's finger with surprising strength. The gesture was so deliberate, so trusting, that both parents fell silent. I think, Hollis said finally, we can try it for a week. See how it goes. Really? Really? But Lachlan? She stood, gathering her things with the efficient movements of someone heading to work. This isn't temporary for him. If you do this, if you commit to being his primary caregiver, you don't get to change your mind when something more interesting comes along. Oliver's security depends on consistency. I understand. I hope you do. She paused at the door, looking back at the man holding their son with such careful reverence. Because this time, if you leave, you don't get to come back. After she was gone, Lachlan sat alone with Oliver in the small apartment that had become the center of his universe. Outside, Portland was waking up to another ordinary day, and for the first time in his adult life, Lachlan Vance was exactly where he belonged. What do you think, little man? He asked his son. Ready to spend the day with your dad? Oliver responded by falling asleep against his father's chest, tiny fingers still wrapped around Lachlan's finger like an anchor holding him to shore. 1 month later, Lachlan Vance was covered in pureed sweet potato, and discovering that his son had inherited his mother's stubborn streak. Come on, Oliver, he coaxed, trying to maneuver another spoonful toward the baby's tightly closed mouth. It's food, not poison. Your mother specifically said sweet potatoes were on the approved list. At 4 months old, Oliver had developed distinct opinions about everything from his sleeping position, to his feeding schedule, to the precise way his father should hold him during tummy time. Right now, his opinion about lunch was decidedly negative, and he was expressing it by turning his head away from every spoonful with the determination of a tiny food critic. Lachlan's phone rang from the kitchen counter, displaying a number that made his stomach clench. David Morrison, senior partner at Morrison & Associates, the most prestigious executive search firm on the West Coast. The same David Morrison who'd been calling twice a week for the past month with increasingly lucrative offers. He let it ring. Daddy's not interested in whatever empire they want him to rebuild today, he told Oliver, who responded by finally accepting a spoonful of sweet potato before immediately spitting it back out with impressive range. Though your aim is getting better, pretty soon you'll be ready for the major leagues. The apartment door opened with the familiar sound of Hollis returning from work. These moments had become Lachlan's favorite part of each day, the transition from solo parenting to shared presence, the way Oliver's face lit up when he heard his mother's voice, the domestic rhythm they'd fallen into without ever discussing what it meant. How did the great sweet potato experiment go? Hollis called from the entryway, where she was hanging up her jacket and shaking rain from her hair. Your son has excellent defensive strategies but needs work on actually consuming nutrients. My son? She appeared in the kitchen doorway, eyebrows raised in amusement. He's only mine when he's being difficult? He's always yours, Lachlan said quietly, the simple truth slipping out before he could censor it. I'm just lucky enough to be part of his story. The words hung between them, carrying more weight than a casual comment about shared parenting. These moments had been happening more frequently, small acknowledgments of the life they were building together, careful steps toward something neither wanted to define too clearly. Hollis moved to the high chair, and Oliver immediately reached for her with the enthusiasm he reserved for his favorite people. "Hello, my sweet boy. Did you give Daddy a hard time about lunch? He's developing sophisticated opinions about food presentation," Lachlan said, beginning the familiar routine of cleaning pureed vegetables from every surface within a 3-foot radius of the high chair. "I think he gets that from you. The discerning palate, not the making a mess part. I don't know, you've gotten pretty good at making messes since you started cooking." Their easy banter was interrupted by Lachlan's phone ringing again. Same number. Morrison wasn't giving up easily. "You should probably answer that," Hollis said, settling Oliver against her hip. "David Morrison doesn't call people repeatedly unless it's important." Lachlan looked at her sharply. "How do you know who's calling?" "Because Eleanor told me. She also told me about the offer." The betrayal hit him like ice water. His mother had promised to stay out of their carefully balanced arrangement, but apparently that promise had limits. "What offer?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. "Chief Technology Officer, Meridian Dynamics. They're offering you a complete corporate restructure, equity stake, and essentially unlimited resources to build their next-generation platform." Hollis's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away about her feelings. "Eleanor said it's the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime. Eleanor talks too much. She's worried about you. We all are." "There's no we to worry about, I'm fine." But even as he said it, Lachlan knew how it sounded. Defensive, brittle, like someone trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. "Answer it," Hollis said firmly. "At least hear what they have to say." "I don't want to hear what they have to say." "Why not?" "Because I know how this ends. I know how persuasive they'll be. How they'll make it sound like the smart choice, the responsible choice, the choice that will secure Oliver's future and prove I haven't completely lost my mind. Maybe it is the smart choice." The words came out so quietly that Lachlan almost missed them. When he looked at Hollis, her face was carefully composed, but he could see the conflict in her eyes. "You want me to take it. I want you to consider it. Really consider it, not just dismiss it because you're afraid of who you used to be." "I'm not afraid." "You're terrified," Hollis interrupted. "You're terrified that if you go back to the corporate world, you'll become the man who left me standing in hotel lobbies and chose board meetings over family dinners." "But Lachlan, hiding from who you were isn't the same as growing into who you could be." Oliver, sensing the tension in his mother's voice, began to fuss. Hollis automatically started the gentle bouncing motion that calmed him, but her eyes never left Lachlan's face. "This isn't hiding," Lachlan said. "This is choosing what matters. What if you could choose both? What if you could be an amazing father and still build something significant in the world? Because I tried that once, remember? I thought I could balance everything, and I ended up losing you. You didn't lose me because you were ambitious. You lost me because you forgot I existed." Hollis's voice was gentle but unflinching. "There's a difference between having a career and being consumed by one." The phone rang again. This time Lachlan answered. "David, I appreciate the persistence, but I'm not interested in—" "Lachlan, just hear me out. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." Against his better judgment, Lachlan found himself listening as Morrison outlined an opportunity that was, admittedly, extraordinary. Meridian Dynamics wasn't just offering him a job. They were offering him the chance to build something revolutionary. Clean energy technology that could change how the world powered itself. A platform that could democratize access to sustainable resources on a global scale. It was the kind of project that could define a generation. The kind of work that mattered beyond profit margins and market share. "The board understands your priorities have shifted," Morrison continued. "They're prepared to offer unprecedented flexibility. Remote work options, family considerations, whatever you need to make this work with your personal life. I need to think about it," Lachlan heard himself saying. "Of course. But Lachlan, this offer expires Friday. They need an answer by then." After he hung up, the apartment felt too small, too quiet except for Oliver's soft babbling as he played with the toy Hollis had given him. "Well?" she asked. "They want to save the world," Lachlan said, slumping onto the couch. "Clean energy, sustainable technology, democratic access to resources. Everything I used to dream about building before I got distracted by quarterly earnings and market dominance. Sounds important. It is important. It's the kind of work that could actually matter, that could make Oliver proud of his father someday instead of just financially secure." Hollis settled beside him on the couch, Oliver contentedly playing between them. So what's the problem? The problem is that I love this life. I love waking up with Oliver, learning his sounds and his preferences and the way he looks at the world like everything is a fascinating puzzle. I love our morning routine and afternoon walks and the way he falls asleep on my chest after dinner. I love... He stopped himself before saying the rest. You love what? I love the way you look when you come home from work and find us reading together. I love how we've learned to be a team without even discussing it. I love that for the first time in my adult life, I'm exactly where I want to be. The confession hung between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared since Oliver's birth. But, Hollis prompted gently, but what if I'm being selfish? What if I'm choosing the easy path because I'm afraid of failing again? What if Oliver grows up and realizes his father had the chance to change the world, but chose to change diapers instead? Oliver, as if sensing the weight of the conversation, rolled onto his back and looked up at both his parents with the solemn intensity that had become his signature expression. What do you think, little man? Hollis asked softly. What should Daddy do? He can't answer that, Lachlan said. Can't he? Hollis picked up Oliver, settling him so he could see both parents clearly. Oliver, should Daddy take the big important job that could change the world, but might mean less time with us? Or should he stay here and be your full-time dad? For a moment, Oliver just stared at them both. Then, with perfect timing, he reached out with both tiny hands, one toward Lachlan, one toward Hollis, and smiled the kind of radiant smile that suggested he understood exactly what was being asked. I think, Hollis said quietly, he's telling us that the choice doesn't have to be either or. What do you mean? I mean, what if the real question isn't whether you take this job, but whether we take it? Together, as a family. The words hit Lachlan like lightning. Hollis, I've been thinking about this for weeks, ever since Eleanor first mentioned the offers you were getting, and I realized something important. She looked down at Oliver, then back at Lachlan. I don't want you to choose between being a father and being who you are in the world. I want you to figure out how to be both, even if it means risking everything we've built here. What we've built here isn't a place, Lachlan. It's trust. It's partnership. It's choosing each other every day no matter what challenges come up. She paused, her voice growing stronger, and I think we're strong enough now to choose each other anywhere. Lachlan looked at his son, then at the woman who'd given him the greatest gift of his life, and realized that the choice he'd been agonizing over was actually the simplest decision he'd ever had to make. David Morrison's going to get a very interesting phone call, he said. Oh? I'm going to tell him that Lachlan Vance accepts the position with one non-negotiable condition, which is that Oliver gets his own office, with a changing table and a crib and a play area, because his father refuses to miss any more milestones for the sake of changing the world. Hollis's smile was brighter than any corporate acquisition, warmer than any boardroom victory. I think Meridian Dynamics is about to discover what family-integrated leadership looks like. Are you sure about this? Lachlan asked. Really sure? Because once I say yes, once we commit to building this together, there's no going back to the safe distance we've maintained. I stopped wanting safe distance the moment you showed up covered in sweet potato, talking to our son like he was your most important board meeting. Oliver chose that moment to grab both his parents' hands, bringing them together in a tangle of fingers and promises and possibilities that felt like the beginning of everything they'd never dared to hope for. Outside, Portland's autumn rain continued to fall, washing the city clean for whatever came next. And inside a small apartment that had become the foundation of everything that mattered, three people who'd learned to choose love over fear were ready to build the future together. 2 years later, the boardroom at Meridian Dynamics looked nothing like the sterile corporate spaces Lachlan had once commanded. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of San Francisco Bay, but more importantly, the conference table was surrounded by comfortable chairs that could accommodate car seats, high chairs, and the occasional toddler who refused to nap during crucial presentations. Today, 26-month-old Oliver Vance was demonstrating his mastery of walking by making determined circuits around the room, while his father presented quarterly sustainability metrics to Meridian's board of directors. As you can see, Lachlan said, clicking to the next slide while simultaneously intercepting Oliver before he could investigate the fascinating buttons on the presentation remote. Our third-quarter implementation of the distributed energy grid exceeded projections by 37%. Oliver looked up at his father with the kind of pleased expression that suggested he knew exactly how impressive 37% was, then promptly sat down to examine his shoes with scientific precision. The Portland pilot program alone, Lachlan continued, effortlessly maintaining his professional presentation while Oliver decided that untying shoelaces was his new favorite activity, has reduced residential energy costs by an average of 42% while increasing grid stability across the entire Pacific Northwest. Board member Catherine Walsh raised her hand. Lachlan, I have to ask, how do you maintain focus on these complex projects while managing? She gestured toward Oliver, who was now attempting to tie his father's shoelaces together. All of this? Simple, Lachlan said, scooping Oliver up and settling him on his hip without missing a beat in his presentation. Oliver here is my accountability partner. Every decision I make, every project I prioritize, I ask myself one question. Will this make him proud of his father in 20 years? If the answer is yes, we move forward. If it's no, we find a better solution. Oliver, apparently approving of this explanation, clapped his hands and pointed toward the screen displaying clean energy statistics. Numbers, he announced proudly, having recently discovered that everything his father did involved lots of impressive numbers. That's right, buddy. Numbers that help make the world better for you and all your friends. The presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, and as the board members filed out for lunch, Lachlan found himself alone with Oliver in the conference room that had become their shared workspace. Through the windows, he could see the Golden Gate Bridge spanning the bay like a promise of connection between distant shores. What do you think, Oliver? Ready for lunch with Mama? Mama, Oliver agreed enthusiastically, then immediately became distracted by his reflection in the polished conference table. Hollis appeared in the doorway right on schedule, carrying her laptop bag and wearing the kind of smile that still made Lachlan's heart skip after all this time. At 33, she'd grown into her role as Meridian's Director of Community Integration, with the same grace she'd brought to everything else in her life. Her auburn hair was shorter now, more professional, but her eyes still held the warmth that had first captured his attention at that tech conference years ago. How did the board presentation go? She asked, settling her bag on the table and automatically reaching for Oliver, who launched himself toward her with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been separated from his favorite person for entire hours. Oliver stole the show as usual. Catherine Walsh wants to hire him as a consultant. Smart woman. He does have excellent instincts about sustainable development. Hollis kissed Oliver's forehead, then looked at Lachlan with the expression that meant she had news. Speaking of excellent instincts, I have something to tell you. Good news or challenging news? Depends on your perspective. She settled Oliver on her hip, mirroring Lachlan's earlier position. The Portland expansion project was so successful that the mayor's office wants to fast-track implementation citywide. Full grid transformation, community energy cooperatives, the whole vision we pitched last year. That's incredible. That's exactly what we hoped would happen when we started this whole. Lachlan stopped as the implications hit him. Wait, fast track means 6 months on site in Portland, full team, complete oversight, essentially rebuilding our lives there while we manage the transition. Lachlan looked at Oliver, who was contentedly playing with his mother's hair, then at Hollis, who was watching him carefully for his reaction. 6 months in Portland, he repeated slowly. 6 months back home, Hollis corrected gently. Back where Oliver was born, where your mother still terrorizes local coffee shops with her opinions about proper child rearing, where we learned how to be a family. The offer hung between them like a gift and a test. 2 years ago, Lachlan would have immediately started calculating the professional implications, the career risks, the strategic advantages. Now, his first thought was simpler. Would this be good for Oliver? Would this be good for them? What do you think? He asked. I think, Hollis said carefully, that it would be nice for Oliver to see where his story began. And I think it would be nice for us to show Portland what we've learned about building something that lasts. Oliver, sensing that important decisions were being discussed, looked solemnly between his parents. At 26 months, he'd developed the unsettling ability to appear far wiser than his age suggested, as if he understood the weight of the choices his parents made on his behalf. What do you say, Oliver? Lachlan asked. Ready for an adventure in Portland with Mama and Daddy? Adventure, Oliver repeated with delight, clapping his hands. Then, with perfect timing, he reached out and grabbed both his parents' hands, bringing them together in the gesture that had become his signature move whenever big decisions needed to be made. I think that's a yes, Hollis said softly. I think that's a yes from all of us. Lachlan agreed. They stood there for a moment in the conference room that had witnessed so many of their family's small victories. Oliver between them like a bridge connecting their past and future. Through the windows, San Francisco sparkled in the afternoon sun, beautiful and temporary, while somewhere up the coast, Portland waited with its rain and its coffee shops and its promise of home. "There's one more thing," Hollis said, her voice carrying a note that made Lachlan look at her more closely. "What is it? When we go back to Portland, we might not be going back as just the three of us." The words took a moment to register. When they did, Lachlan's face transformed with an expression of wonder that made him look exactly like Oliver when he discovered something marvelous. "Really? Really? About 10 weeks along. I wanted to be sure before." She gestured vaguely, encompassing their careful balance of work and family, the delicate ecosystem they'd built around Oliver's needs. "Another baby," Lachlan said softly, as if testing how the words felt. "Another adventure," Hollis corrected. "If you're ready for it." Lachlan looked at Oliver, who was studying his parents with the intense concentration he applied to all interesting developments, then at Hollis, whose face held the same mixture of hope and uncertainty he remembered from Oliver's early days. "I'm ready," he said simply. "We're ready. We've gotten pretty good at this family thing." "We have, haven't we?" Oliver, apparently deciding that enough serious conversation had occurred, launched into an enthusiastic rendition of his favorite song, a tuneless but heartfelt performance that involved lots of la-la-la sounds and interpretive dancing that nearly sent him tumbling off his mother's hip. "I love you," Lachlan said to Hollis, the words carrying the weight of everything they'd survived and everything they were choosing to build together. "I love you too," she replied. "All of us." As they gathered their things to leave Meridian for the day, Lachlan caught sight of their reflection in the conference room's polished windows. A family of 3, soon to be 4, heading home together after another day of changing the world in small, significant ways. Outside, San Francisco's evening fog was beginning to roll in from the bay, but inside the building that had become their second home, 3 people who'd learned to choose love over fear were ready for whatever adventure came next. Whether that adventure led them back to Portland's familiar rain or forward into uncharted territory, they would face it together, building something lasting one decision at a time. And somewhere in the distance, the future waited with all its beautiful, terrifying possibilities, ready to be shaped by the choices of people brave enough to believe that love could triumph over any challenge that dared to stand in its way. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding each other. They're about choosing each other, again and again, even when the choice is hard. What choices are you making today that will shape the love story of your tomorrow? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.